Well, it's a great honor to be able to speak to our subject today and to be with you. Um, Papers like this are sometimes, in terms of the planning, easy to execute. You have an idea, or at least I do. Maybe this is not your experience. I have an idea where I'm going, and it unfolds, obviously, fairly naturally. This paper was not in that category. I began with an idea and it didn't turn out that way. And it has a life of its own. And I'm sure you've had that experience. You're not exactly sure where the paper is going. You have the general idea being encompassed by the rubric over which the conference is being held, being Baptist, past, present, and future. My focus is on the past. But I didn't exactly know how it would unfold. I initially thought I would focus on Eastern Canada, that is Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes, and be able to look at Edward Manning, who in many ways is the architect after the somewhat tumultuous fallout from the revival of Henry Align, and then look at Henrietta Feller at the Grandny Mission in Quebec, and then end up with a man named John Cameron, whose manuscripts fell into my hands about a year or two ago. But it has taken a very, very different course. As we will see, the focus is Ontario, with a little bit over into Quebec, what is now Quebec, because I'm dealing with the Ottawa Valley, which deals obviously with both sides of the provincial borders. And instead, it is focused on two figures. William Davies, who is a meat packer, a very significant figure, I think, in Toronto Baptist life. The more famous figure is the figure in Toronto Baptist life after which this eminent school is named, McMaster. William McMaster and William Davies, as you'll see, knew each other intimately and did not like each other. And we'll look at mostly from Davies' point of view. And then the second figure is from the Scottish, Gaelic-speaking Highland Scottish tradition of the Ottawa Valley, Daniel MacPhail, who is sometimes known as the Elijah of the Ottawa Valley. And then to make our dear brother who just introduced me happy, we end with a Canadian war poet at the very, very end. So, being Baptist, two iterations in Ontario, the 18 teens to the 19 teens. Donald Gertz, some of you know Professor Gertz, the Canadian Baptist historian who taught for many years at what is now Tyndale University, rightly noted some 40 years ago that one of the leading characteristics of 19th century Ontario Baptist life was its fractiousness. At both the local and associational levels, Gertz wrote in 1982, there seemed to be a belligerent and polemical spirit which expressed itself in a readiness to enter into conflict. Not only were there internal battles over these Baptist communities, over everything from politics to church members' debts, the Baptists in this period carried on the very traditional Baptist perspective that if a member went into bankruptcy, that was a violation of that passage in Romans, owe no man anything, and therefore he was liable or she was liable to church discipline. But there were also external conflicts against old ecclesiastical opponents, the Anglicans and their attempts, obviously, to establish the Church of England as the state church here in what was then Upper Canada, and then Presbyterians. It's very interesting to read some of the pamphlet wars that took place in places like Chesley and Tiverton, places that are today very minor little villages, but places of very strong Christian testimony, and the pamphlet wars between Presbyterians and Baptists in that era. And then there were, bothering the Baptists at the end of the 19th century, emerging restoration groups who are pressing for a more radical ecclesiology, namely the Plymouth Brethren. And one of the big questions is, why did I'm not going to answer this, but why were the Plymouth Brethren very attractive to Scottish Baptists in the London area, but not attractive to Scottish Baptists in the Ottawa Valley? And then, of course, the Campbellites, the disciples of Christ. The determination of the degree to which these various battles shaped Ontarian Baptist identity in the 19th century requires a much more extensive study than can be afforded by a plenary paper such as this one. There is a real need, I think, for a study of Ontario Baptist life. There was one made, as many of you are aware, back many years ago by Stuart Iveson and Rosser, but it only took the story up to 1820. And we need something that will take the story well into the 20th century. This is not that. The content of this essay is more circumscribed, therefore, and somewhat microscopic in nature. I tend to be, and I wasn't trained this way. I was trained as an intellectual historian in patristics by a man who was very much focused on ideas. John Egan, a Jesuit, and he came out of the school of ressourcement, founded by Henri de Lubac and Jean Donilou, very much focused on ideas. And over the years, though, I have found myself much more biographically oriented. Ideas are very important, but ideas only have legs, as the saying goes, as they grip the minds and hearts of human beings, and those human beings put those ideas into action. I felt somewhat justified in my approach last night by beginning to read Michael Bliss's Right Honorable Men, where he studies Canadian politics through 10 or 12 prime ministers, and he emphasizes the importance of biography for doing history. So I'm looking at what I'm calling two iterations of Baptist life in this era and region of Canada. I hope to provide some guidance in doing so for a more macroscopic survey. Consider then, if you will, these as windows onto a larger vista. These iterations find their focus in the lives of two Baptist figures in central Canada: William Davies, 1831 to 1921, an English-born meatpacker and breeder from the south of England. We'll see. He comes out of an area that had known rich revival in the Berkshire area, near places like, you wouldn't necessarily know these names, Wallingford, Reading, and so on. And Daniel MacPhail, an evangelist from the Gaelic-speaking Scottish world of the Ottawa Valley. We begin with Davies. The founder of a company that in time became a key part of Canada Packers, William Davies is remembered today as the most important pioneer in the Canadian meatpacking industry. Those are the words of Michael Bliss. The product of a staunch particular Baptist lineage, Davies grew up in the Berkshire market town of Wallingford, where there had been a robust particular Baptist congregation since the 1790s. Converted and baptized as a believer in the late 1840s, he emigrated his wife, Amelia Holtby, to what was then Canada West in 1854. For a number of years, he was a member of Toronto's Bond Street Baptist Church, where his pastor during the second half of the 1850s was Robert Alexander Fife, from the Scottish Baptist tradition in the Ottawa Valley. Davies first heard Fife preach on Sunday, July the 29th, 1855, when the latter was being considered for a second pastorate in the church. Fife had already preached, had been the pastor back in the mid-1840s, from 1844 to 1848, and then he had taken a time as an itinerant evangelist, and a time in the States, and then he had been called back to Ontario. Interesting, the reasons for him coming back to Ontario, his deep recognition of the fact that there were tons of Baptist preachers available in the States, but Ontario had great need, something that has always resonated with me over the years. Prior to hearing Fife, Davies had noted in a letter to his brother James back in England, "Mr. Fife is coming to preach here on Sunday, and I think there's no doubt he'll accept the call. Some say he's an Arminian in sentiment." That's not a good thing. But as I have not heard him, I cannot say. After hearing Fife that Sunday, Davies was not at all impressed. This is really interesting because Fife is regarded as Mr. Baptist of the 19th century. As he told his brother in the same letter, it's now Sunday night, 10 p.m. I've heard Mr. Fife twice today. Can't say I like him much. His sermon in the morning was more like a lecture in a mechanics institute than a gospel sermon. This eve he was better, but not nearly so good as Dr. Piper. James Piper was the previous minister who had resigned that June. He was a Scotsman by birth. You need to note that up until at the time of Confederation, somewhat close to 60% of people living in Ontario came from the British Isles. They were either Welsh, Irish, Scots, or Welsh, Irish, Scots, English. And then there was about 30% were French Canadians, and then about 10% are First Peoples. And so it's a very different world than our world. The church was informed of Fife's acceptance of a call to commence his second pastorate in the church 2 weeks after Davies heard him preach. Davies was not slow in commenting to his brother, I hope he may be useful. That's a very key term, and I won't discourse on this, but Dr. Crocker has done a PhD thesis on John Ryland Jr., who's one of my heroes in many ways, and he brings out the importance of that term. And I had read this term numerous times. It's interesting how you can read something and not understand what's being said. And Dr. Crocker really brings out that is such an important term, that a man be useful and received kindly among the people, but I hear a good many say they don't like him. That November, Davies was willing to admit Fife was a very good and worthy man, though he still didn't care for his sermons. As he once again confided in his brother, I do not very much like Mr. Fife, our new minister. There's no doubt he's a very excellent man, but there's no life in his sermons, and they're all read. He must have read his sermons from the pulpit, which again would go against, to some degree, Baptist life, the whole idea of the Spirit moving you as you preach extemporaneously. I'm fearful the cause, that is, the church, will not keep up. By January, he was so fed up, he was contemplating leaving Bond Street to attend Zion Congregational Church, the mother church of Ontarian Congregationalism. It was the only Congregationalist church in Toronto at the time, and it would be the mother church of Congregationalism in Ontario during the 19th century. They had just about to call a new minister, Thomas Scales Ellaby, who was an Englishman, and he was about to commence a ministry of 10 years. He had been the minister of the Anglophone church in St. Petersburg, and he had a very high reputation for thoughtful and scholarly sermons. 10 years after the Congregationalist church, he would horrify his congregation by taking Anglican orders, but that's down the road. Davies told his brother he'd not heard Ellaby, but I have some thoughts of going, if I like him, attending regularly. But I don't like the idea of running away from our own denomination. He's a Baptist. As it turned out, Davies did not leave Bond Street to sit under Ellaby's preaching, but he continued to gripe about Fife as a preacher. On the morning of May the 3rd, 1857, Fife preached on the Song of Songs 2:15. You need to again recognize the Song of Songs is a mainstay of preaching in this world. There are more commentaries written on the Song of Songs between Bede 700 and the Reformation than any other biblical book. Most of them written by monks. There's recently a book that's come out on Spurgeon and his Song of Songs. He preached 81 sermons on the Song of Songs, probably more than any other book. And the sermon, please note the text, because this text will come up again. It's Song of Songs 2:15. Take us the foxes, the little foxes. Davies described what he heard that from the pulpit that morning. He gave us an introduction for half an hour, nearly on the species of foxes, solitary and gregarious, And the grapes, the size they've attained in England, the circumference of the stalk of the vine in Palestine, the area of the shade, etc., etc. Maybe he's exaggerating, but still, you can imagine that for somebody like Davies, who is a Calvinistic Baptist, who once wrote robust theological sermons, he must have been deeply frustrated. Well, he was. Davies reiterated his conviction he believed Fyfe to be a good man, but of the smallest caliber. I mean, his preaching. He's a good man. He's a man of good judgment and common sense, but not the least weight as a preacher. 3 weeks later, Davies was thrilled the baptism of 2 new believers had filled the chapel to capacity, but he was still critical of Fyfe's preaching. I think our pastor improved some, but I shall never enjoy him as a preacher. This is a very interesting look at Fyfe. Fyfe would become the man. In fact, we have a statue of him, do we not? A bust of him. Where is it? Voila. And he would obviously go on to found he'd be the first principal of Canada Literary Institute, which would become ultimately Toronto Baptist College and McMaster University. And so he's lauded, but it's very interesting to see, like, what was he from the other side of, how did people view him from the pew? Eventually, Davies and a number of other discontented members of Bond Street left in the summer of 1859 to form a new congregation on Albert Street near Yonge Street. And this finding out about this church was a very interesting experience because it doesn't last. The space is now occupied by the Eaton Center. So next time you're in the Eaton Center, just think of the little Albert Street church there. The immediate reason for Davies' decision to finally leave had to do with the grave injustice that Davies suffered to the hands of a business partner, Francis T. Parson, who was also a member of Bond Street. Davies sought to have the matter brought before the church as he was convinced that Parson, quote, acted in a manner unbecoming a Christian. I'm not going to go into all the details. Basically, Davies feels Parsons swindled him to some degree. And it needed to be church discipline. However, Fyfe was able to persuade the members of the church Parson had done nothing wrong. In Fyfe's eyes, quote, he was an honest man. And Davies' grievance was accordingly dismissed. Siding with Fyfe was the other most powerful figure in the church, William McMaster, the wealthiest merchant in Toronto, according to Davies, if not the wealthiest, one of the wealthiest, but a man whom Davies also regarded, quote, as very obstinate, self-willed, and likes to lead the minister by the nose. The truth of the matter is, Davies was similar in many ways to McMaster. In the words of Canadian historian Michael Bliss, the meatpacker was a classic rugged individualist. Davies also had a reputation for rugged Christian integrity. And it was this probity that led Davies, along with 2 of the church deacons and a number of others, finally to quit Bond Street after the fracas about Parsons' business practices. Davies and his friends lost no time in borrowing money for the construction of a building that was to be named the Baptist Tabernacle and which could accommodate a congregation of 400. And Mr. Roberts was called to be the church's first minister. I've not been able to find out anything further on this man. The like of his preaching, Davies told his brother, he had not heard since he'd left England. He was thrilled. A person whose wife is a member of Bond Street has, under the preaching of Mr. Roberts, been brought to feel himself a sinner, and for the last 2 or 3 weeks has neither been able to give sleep to his eyes nor slumber to his eyelids, but is now, I think, being taken out of the horrible pit and the miry clay and set upon a rock. That's an allusion to Psalm 40, verse 2. Another similarly situated, as regards his wife, I was pleased to find last night, was in a very interesting state of mind. I noticed the word interesting. For an Englishman, I grew up in England. When you say the word interesting, it can mean a variety of things. Here it has a positive meaning. Sometimes when I say to a person, that was very interesting, I am thinking in my mind, that was the stupidest thing I've ever heard, but I'm too polite to tell you. I think it's positive here. Then as regards myself, and I think I may say others who've been members of churches for years, I've been led to think very seriously whether I had any name or place among the Lord's people. I'm able to meditate with profit on the sermons I now hear. Obviously, something he hadn't done with Fife. Our text last night was the fear of the wicked, it shall come upon him, and the desire of the righteous, it shall be granted unto him. And I think it has never been my lot to hear a more faithful sermon. On the whole, we are seeing the commencement of good days. The Baptist Tabernacle, which came to be known simply as Albert Street Baptist Church, was designed by Henry Langley, the undisputed Dean of Ecclesiastical Architecture of Victorian Ontario. Octagon in shape, its brick foundation supported a wooden structure, the exterior of which was covered in a plaster coating that gave the impression of a stone exterior. Although Davies and his friends wanted no pretensions to ornament within the church, they believed that the interior would present an excellent combination of simple materials and look much better than many places on which a large amount of money had been expended. This is important, as we will see. This emphasis on the plainness of the Albert Street Church is noteworthy. In having the church designed this way, Davies and his fellow Baptists were consciously imitating the sort of church buildings that have been typical of 18th century and early 19th century Baptist communities on both sides of the Atlantic. And last summer, Dr. Song and I spent 2 weeks in Norfolk going around these little Baptist churches which fit this to a T. This is part of Baptist identity. You may not think about the building that you worship in, but we create the buildings and the buildings shape us, and they say something about us. And with their plain exteriors and severely unadorned interiors, they had possessed both an austere beauty, there is an austere beauty to them, and studied simplicity. In fact, as the church was being constructed on Albert Street, passers-by were puzzled as to its purpose. It didn't look at all like a house of Christian worship. The first worship services were held in the church on Sunday, June 3rd, 1860, when Roberts preached in the morning, and the Congregationalist minister, so the Congregationalist minister was invited. Thomas Ellaby spoke in the evening. 19 months later, however, the entire church building and grounds were being auctioned off and was subsequently purchased by the Evangelical Union Church. I've not done any study as to what that body might be, so that would be an interesting little kind of sidelight to find out the church that did buy the building. The building obviously is gone, long gone. The reasons for the demise of the congregation are unknown. It could be that the leadership fell out. Davies was a strong-minded man. I think, though, it's this. There might not have been enough congregants to provide financially for the church's existence. In the fall of 1860, Davies admitted the church was, quote, not flourishing as so well as I would like to see. However, we must pray and hope for an improvement. Davies' hope, though, never materialized. Davies eventually ended up at Alexander Street Baptist Church, which had been formed in 1866 by another exodus of members from Bond Street. By the 1870s, Davies was the treasurer of this church, which was renamed Emmanuel Baptist Church in 1889, when it relocated to the corner of Jarvis and Wellesley Streets. So just up the road from where Bond Street had relocated at Jarvis and Gerrard. So you need to bear that geography in mind. Here, from 1878 to 1889, Davies sat under what he later described in 1901 as the tremendous force and energy and divine afflatus of the preaching of Joshua Denevan. And I'm very thankful to Dr. Wilson for doing a really excellent article on Denevan as a kind of precursor of men like Elmore Harris and the more well-known T.T. Shields. Davies clearly delighted in the fact that Denevan was uncompromising in his Calvinistic Baptist convictions. Denevan came to Toronto, Davies recalled, quote, as an avowed Baptist, a regular Baptist, that means he's closed communion, a pronounced Baptist, and he came with the intention of preaching the doctrines of grace. So this is Calvinism. By the term regular Baptist, Denevan meant that he was committed to the practice of closed communion, that is, the admission of only baptized believers by immersion to the Lord's Supper. Davies went on to note Denevan's deep appreciation for the grand old Puritanic doctrines and the solid rock of the Calvinistic theology, all of which could be termed the Pauline and Augustinian doctrines of grace. In sum, Davies considered Denneman's preaching and teaching to be pungent, poignant, and attractive to the studious and thoughtful. 3 years before Joshua Denneman assumed the pastor of Alexander Street, Davies' former congregation on Bond Street Baptist Church had built a new edifice on the corner of Jarvis and Gerrard Streets. Henry Langley was also the architect of this new church building, with his partners, his brother Edward, who was a builder, and Edmund Burke, who is also, I think, as significant an architect in his own right as Henry Langley. Both Burke and Langley were part of that Gothic revival that had been started in Britain, and then it caught the fancy of many British Baptists. All you have to do is compare a typical 18th century Baptist church in England with a mid-19th century Baptist church, and the latter looks much more like an Anglican church with spire and so on. To see that there has been a change in thinking about who are we and how do we fit into the public square. Built in the neo-Gothic style, this is Jarvis Street today. Built in the neo-Gothic style that was then all the rage with church structures, the Jarvis Street church included a variety of elements inspired by medieval cathedrals, including a spire. It also has gargoyles, but I think the gargoyles were added later. Is that correct?
I think that's right. The building burned to the ground, right, in
Right.
1939. So I don't think we see gargoyles today.
No, the gargoyles are there today.
Oh, are they?
Oh, yeah.
Well, then that would have been after 30.
Yeah, the gargoyles are there today.
They're happy gargoyles.
Yeah, they're happy.
They are happy gargoyles. They're not doing the typical medieval gargoyles, what gargoyles do. But it's weird. It's absolutely weird in a Baptist church to go in and see these gargoyles. Anyway, up to 1,500 or so could easily meet for worship, seated in the pews in the main auditorium of the church and its gallery. If extra chairs were added, another 700 could be accommodated. William McMaster's prominent role in funding this neo-Gothic structure. He paid the bulk of the money for the land, and then he built the building. Once again, stirred Davies to criticism. And this is what he wrote in another letter, not to his brother. There's been built in the city recently a large Baptist chapel, Gothic, brownstone, spire pointing upward, if not heavenward. That's a bit of a dig. Marble baptistry, etc., cost $100,000 and odd. The organ, $7,000 besides. And I believe it's all paid for, but it's being built regardless of the needs of the city. In other words, it's in a wrong locale. It was on what would be called Millionaires Row. I should have consulted it. I've got a book on the history of Jarvis Street, and that was quite a prestigious street in those days. The congregation were in a part of the city which was thickly populated, but they had an old-fashioned building. One of the members, an MLC, this is McMaster, which is a member of the Legislative Council, say a senator, he was one of our first senators, very wealthy, married an American, this is his second wife, Susan Moulton. Natural result, they soon had an American minister, which is John Castle. Then this new building, also American. It's interesting, he says it's American, but it's really inspired by Britain more. And then the lady and the minister lay their heads together and they get a professional singer, a sort of prima donna. She's paid $300 a year per year, and many have very much heard about it. Being sanctioned by a large majority, and the result will be that I expect some of their best people leave. This is the key piece. There's been appears to be in a spirit of centralization and aggrandizement about it, which is hateful. Davies was, of course, referring to William McMaster and his American-born wife, Susan Moulton. I just found out doing this paper, Susan Moulton is a lineal descendant of Ebenezer Moulton, who's claimed to be one of the first Baptist ministers in Nova Scotia, which I had no idea of the connection. His mention of the building of the Jarvis Street Church as being inspired by a spirit of centralization and aggrandizement, which he found intensely distasteful, was not only an expression of his own frugal temperament, but also reflective of his Baptistic individualism. As Harold Innes, again, it was Dr. Wilson put me on to Harold Innes, I don't know if you recall this.
Yeah, I do.
And Harold Innes studied here at McMaster, was a Baptist when he went to the Western Front and lost his faith in the trenches. He knew Baptist life, though, very well. The father, as we would describe today, of Canadian economic history, and himself born and raised in an evangelical Baptist environment in Southern Ontario, recognized Davies' independence of spirit was a commonality of Baptist life in Ontario. But there's something else going on here. And when I read, I was able to find a copy of the letters of William Davies by an Ottawa bookseller. I didn't think any existed. I got it for $30. I couldn't believe it. Came in the mail. And as I went through it, I'd been going through the online version. But as I went through it and went through the introduction by Innes, and then the forward by Innes, and the introduction by William Sherwood Fox, who is the grandson of William Davies, there was not a mention, 1945, not a mention of the fact that Davies, on more than one occasion, expresses, to my mind, a repulsive racism. Now, you have to remember, I'm Irish background, mom born and raised in the south of Ireland. So there might be a little bit of that going on here. Davies' dislike of McMaster and his influence on Bond Street and then at Jar Street was more than theological. McMaster was an Irishman from Omagh in County Tyrone, and Davies' correspondence reveals what an all too common attitude towards the Irish on the part of Englishmen, a deep-seated racial bigotry that was tied to the fact that Ireland was predominantly Roman Catholic. Davies goes on about priest-ridden Ireland and Quebec. And as he said on one occasion, Ireland was priest-ridden. And those who emigrated from there to Canada were Irish vermin. Nor was he overly fond of Protestants in Ulster. I mean, you might say, okay, that's the Catholics. Now, what about the Protestants? Well, as he told his brother, I'm not too fond. He's actually referring to the Orangemen. But most of the Protestants would have had some links with the Orange Lodge. It's amazing. I mean, up until the 50s, you still have the Orange Parades. It's just 60s.
I remember them.
I
Yeah,
remember them too.
yeah, they're all gone. Thankfully. It needs to be borne in mind, for example, in 1847, as a direct result of the devastating Irish famine, the vast majority of the more than 38,000 immigrants that one year who flooded in the city, nearly double the size of the population in Toronto, mostly predominantly Protestant, were Irish Roman Catholics. For most Anglophone Protestants in Toronto, like Davies, the Irish were, quote, completely lacking in industry, honesty, and ambition, and they were generally dirty in their habits. And my point being here is that when Baptist identity is being constructed, it's more than simply ecclesiological, theological. There are other things that enter into that equation that have to be taken into consideration. Davies' correspondence with his brother and then his reminiscences about John Stuart Donovan reveal that the solid preaching of the scriptures was certainly central in his concept of what it meant to be a Baptist. Without such, sinners would not be converted, nor the saints edified. Davies also seems to have regarded a commitment to Calvinistic soteriology as vital to the flourishing of the Baptist cause. And yet, his sense of Baptist identity was not free from racial prejudice. This can be seen in his dislike of the Irish in general and his long-standing quarrel with William McMaster in particular. Now we shift gears. How am I for time?
You're finished at 1:40, so.
Oh, good.
So a little bit of time for questions.
I will try to have some time for questions. Although Davies had little time for Fife as a preacher, one hopes he would surely appreciate the Scottish Baptist tradition of preaching and piety from which Fife had sprung in the Ottawa Valley. At the close of the Napoleonic Wars, among various Gaelic-speaking Highlanders who emigrated to Canada were a group from the Baptist causes in Killen and Laws on Loch Tay in Perthshire. The roots of these churches went back to a large-scale awakening in the Loch Tay district in 1801 and 1802, in which the preaching of an evangelist by the name of John Farquharson, who had been trained by James Haldane and his older brother Robert Haldane, were instrumental. Sailing from Greenock on the Dorothy on July the 12th, 1815, only a few weeks after the Battle of Waterloo, these Baptists landed at Montreal after a lengthy voyage. That year they wintered in the southern portion of Glengarry County. The following spring they made their way north to Breadalbin, not far from present-day Dalkeith. You look in vain on most of our maps to find Breadalbin. You really have to get a very, very, very detailed topographical map to find the little village. A Baptist church was formally organized a year later on August the 2nd, 1817, with 13 members, 2 elders, Alan McDermott and Peter McDougall. By 1829, church membership had grown to about 60, yet they lacked a pastor who could devote himself to fully ministering to the needs of the church and reaching out into the surrounding communities with the gospel. The Breadalbin Baptists discovered that John Edwards, a Scotsman from Morayshire, who had been converted through the ministry of James Haldane and who had had the oversight of a Baptist work at Clarence on the Ottawa River since the early 1820s, was preparing to sail back to Scotland with the aim of encouraging pastors there to emigrate to Eastern Ontario because of the region's great spiritual needs. They asked him to seek out a suitable pastor for their congregation. Edwards sailed for Britain in the summer of 1829. We know of 2 who responded positively to his invitation to emigrate. John Gilmore, that's a very well-known name around here. His sons and grandsons would have deep connections, and great-grandsons with McMaster, who came to Montreal in 1830, organized the First Baptist Church there. Gilmore had been a sailor and had been taken prisoner during the Napoleonic Wars and spent about 10 years in a French prison where he learned French. And so he was enormously helpful. And then William Fraser, who is an absolutely remarkable man. He would pastor at Breadalbin for about 30 years. And then he would decide to go over to near the Port Elgin area, Tiverton. He'd end up at Kincardine and Tiverton. And he gathered a congregation of about 300 in Tiverton. Now, if you've ever been to Tiverton, we used to vacation at Port Elgin and go down to Kincardine. I mean, Tiverton, the only reason you have to slow down is you come into the main street and you have to do a kind of a right and then a left. Otherwise, you're through the place in like a few seconds. But if you stop and go to the graveyard there, it's filled with Highland Scots from the Hebrides and etc. Over the course of 1834 and 1835, Gilmore and Fraser were key leaders in a large-scale awakening among the Baptists in the Ottawa Valley. We have forgotten this. We need to remember this, I think. It's known as the Great Revival of 1834 and 1835. All told, some 365 individuals were added to the 6 Baptist churches in this region of Upper Canada between August 1834 and December 1835. And as a direct result of that was formed the Ottawa Baptist Association in the depths of a Canadian winter. Actually, it took place in Montreal. Among the stated aims of this association were the deepening of the ties of friendship between those Baptist churches as agree in holding the sentiments commonly called evangelical, as well as the advance of the cause of Christ. For the latter, it was stressed, there was needed, quote, men of deep personal piety, of compassion for ruined, undying souls, strong as power, yet tender as a mother's heart, of love to Christ, which glows with unceasing ardor, of holy, harmless zeal, which never tires, of humility that sinks into the insignificance of a cipher, of moral courage, which meets difficulties, insurmountable to others as little things. Now, in the minds of many who became members of the churches of the association in the 19th century, the Scottish-Canadian preacher, Daniel MacPhail, was a paragon of such piety. The eldest son of Scottish Baptists who had been impacted by the ministry of Robert Haldane, MacPhail was converted, baptized around 1826 in Dalesville Baptist Church. They're celebrating their 200th anniversary this year. Within the year, he was regularly leading the worship of the church, although he was about 19 years of age. And in the midst of the revival of 1834, 1835, MacPhail had invited Gilmore to take a week of meetings at Dalesville. Gilmore agreed to come at the close of January 1835, but he urged MacPhail to pray for divine blessing. As he told MacPhail, "Be earnest in prayer that souls may be converted to God." Gilmore preached his first sermon on the final clause of Isaiah 66:8. For as soon as Zion travailed, she brought forth her children. Subsequent meetings were held every night throughout the week that followed, but there seemed to be no significant response to the gospel message of salvation. One evening, after the public service, MacPhail, along with a few friends, concerned that they were relying upon Gilmore's giftedness as a preacher, decided to spend some time wrestling in prayer for God's blessing upon the preaching of the word. Their earnestness swallowed up any sense of time, and before they knew it, they had spent the entire night in prayer. The following day was long remembered as a Pentecost in Dalesville, as the Holy Spirit came down in great power, and some 20 people were converted. Passing through such an evident work of the Spirit gave MacPhail deep convictions about the vital necessity of prayer in the Christian life. In the early 1890s, Alexander MacDonald was converted, mentored under MacPhail, who was a pioneer Baptist church planter in the Canadian Northwest and had been profoundly shaped by MacPhail's ministry. Recalled that MacPhail was a man of continual prayer by day and by night, in the closet, in the family, as he sat, as he walked, in the pulpit and out of it. His ardent spirit held converse with his master. It was also during this revival that MacPhail became certain of a call to vocational ministry. And since there was no school in central Canada to pursue formal theological education, it's interesting he didn't think of going to Nova Scotia to Orton Academy. And I find that significant. The development of Baptists in Ontario and the development of Baptists in Nova Scotia or in the Maritimes, there seems to be a sundering there. That the influences are, you would expect richer and deeper influences, but they're not generally. And so he goes down to the Hamilton and Theological Institute, now Colgate University in Hamilton, New York, in the summer of 1835. One of the big concerns then, and we still have it, do we not, of ministerial students going to the States is, will they come back? And he did. He spent 3 years studying at this American school, and it was also here that he met R.A. Fife and formed a long friendship, which we will see will be shattered. MacPhail returned to Canada after graduation in 1838, was ordained the following January. In the summer months of 1839, following his ordination, MacPhail was invited to preach in the community of Osgood, due south of what is now Ottawa. The result of a number of weeks of preaching in a barn. There's a great statement in the life of Robert Hall, where Hall recalls an Anglican rebuking him by saying, "Your religion is the religion of barns," a reference to where Baptists often preached. And it had been turned into a makeshift auditorium, and the result was the conversion and baptism of 26 men and women who were formed into a church on Sunday, July the 14th. MacPhail described in a letter what had taken place in the community as the word of God had been preached. The people in Osgood were moral. They had a form of religion and thought it sufficient. But when their eyes were opened by the ever-blessed Spirit to see that morality or any other natural excellence whatever, that nothing short of a change of heart could save them, they became awfully altered. Never have I witnessed the power of truth to such an extent as among that people. The finished work of Christ as a ground of hope for perishing sinners seemed to be all their desire. Indeed, I was never tried so much as when pressed upon them to show him what does a saving faith consist, and how was the heart interested in it. In the same letter, MacPhail noted that the newly formed body of believers were making plans for an appropriate place of worship. But he asked, where is the person to occupy the pulpit. William Fraser of Breadalbane was of the opinion MacPhail himself was the best man to serve as the new church's pastor. In fact, Fraser commented, neither Hermes nor Apollo, his mythical divine master speech, could please the Osgood congregation half as much as MacPhail. It was not until the following year, though, that MacPhail agreed to be the pastor of the Osgood work, and he would serve there for the next 25 years. Any reluctance on MacPhail's part to assume this pastoral charge, which mostly consisted of fellow Highland Scots men and women, probably stemmed from his deep sense of a call to do the work of an evangelist. Looking back at MacPhail's life from the vantage point of the 1890s, Alexander MacDonald observed that while MacPhail was a faithful and diligent pastor, his preeminent excellency lay in his power as an evangelist. He had a burning zeal for the salvation of souls. His motto seemed to be, knowing the terror of the Lord, we persuade men. He counted his labor as fruitless if souls were not led to Christ. That little phrase there, and I've taken it out of the footnotes, is almost an identical phrase to what John Bunyan says in his Grace Abounding, the Chief of Sinners, when he talks about his own ministry. And it's very difficult, can you prove organic connection? But it just sounds the same. Not surprisingly, MacPhail had little time for sermons that failed to focus on the major issues of the Christian life. MacDonald recalled an occasion when MacPhail was listening to a sermon on the first clause of Song of Songs 2:15. We've already encountered that, right? I don't think he's listening to R.A. Fife, but it's interesting. The preacher, who had a penchant for splitting hairs, dwelt for a long period on the incorrectness of the received translation, the KJV, and tried to impress on the minds of the plain people in the congregation the important fact it shouldn't be the little foxes at all, but jackals. The man on fire for souls, that's MacPhail, was noticed to be very ill at ease during this disquisition, and some who sat near him heard him giving audible expression to his impatience with the bah, little jackals. And anyway, under the powerful ministry of MacPhail's preaching, the church at Osgood flourished. When MacPhail became the pastor, there were 60 members. A year later, the membership had increased to 76 by the annual assembly of the Ottawa Association in 1846, at which MacPhail preached the introductory sermon. The Osgood Church had 99 members. A dozen years later, this had nearly doubled to 192 on two occasions between 1854 and 1856, and then again between 1860 and 1862. MacPhail baptized some 90 persons in those years. In 1860, 5 years before MacPhail left Osgood, the membership stood at 245, by far the largest church in the association. A number of those converted into MacPhail, and I've only given a few, but there's quite a number of others who could be mentioned here, went on to become key leaders within the Ottawa Association, but further afield. Alexander MacDonald, who I've already mentioned. John McLaurin, an influential missionary in India for much of his life. MacPhail baptized him and 60 others one winter's day in the early 1850s in a hole cut in the ice. Now you might be thinking, the bravery of these souls. But think about MacPhail. He has to stand there and baptize 60 people. And they didn't have waiters. Daniel Arthur McGregor. I was going to spend some time on McGregor. He's one of my great heroes of this period. He was the principal rather, of the McMaster Divinity, what would become McMaster Divinity College for about a year. His hymn is downstairs. Jesus, Wondrous Savior, the McMaster hymn. Absolutely gorgeous hymn. And which I think it's a quintessential Canadian, an expression of quintessential Canadian Baptist piety in this period. Of the families in the Osgood congregation, it was said every dinner table was a theological class, with the pork and potatoes, with Calvinism and Arminianism, and the Bible serving as the arbiter of the daily discussion. E.W. Dadson was a Baptist leader at the time. There was no escaping God and the Bible in that community. MacPhail's acceptance of the Osgood pastorate did not mean that his itinerant labors came to a complete end. He continued to engage in evangelistic work as opportunity allowed, and probably planted, in the opinion of Jones Hughes Farmer, probably planted more churches than any other Baptist in this period. But let me jump over, and I've got how many? 8 minutes. Oh, I've got what's that?
That includes question.
I'm sorry. I've got a section here on Christian liberty. And he wrote a circular letter on the absolute vital importance of Christian liberty. And in the middle of page 26, pagans and papists have an equal right with evangelical Christians to worship any being they choose and to propagate their religious sentiments without human interference. And he talks about how Baptist identity is wrapped up in this. And let me jump then over to page 28. Now, I apologize. If my problem is my asides. If I just stuck to the paper, I would have gotten through it. 3 years later, after he wrote this, he wrote this paper. Please read the paper on religious liberty. It goes to the heart of what many in the 19th century saw as vital to being a Baptist, that we believe in liberty of conscience. 3 years after MacPhail's convictions about Christian liberty were deeply tested, when his close friend R.A. Fife refused to attend the ordination of an open communion Baptist, James Mackey, he'd been at Perth, to the pastorate of Ottawa's First Baptist Church. He was invited along with John Gilmore, who's an open communionist, and it says Dr. Ben Davies. It can't be Benjamin Davies, who was the first principal of Canada Baptist College, because he was back in England. So I'm not sure who the Davies is, but anyway. The validity of Mackey's ordination was questioned by Fife, because he was in his being open communion, he was an enemy of the regular Baptists. For many 19th century Baptists in Ontario, the practice of closed communion went to the heart of their Baptist identity. For instance, in the December 1859 issue of the Christian Messenger, which he owned and edited, Fife was critical of the embrace by C.H. Spurgeon of open communion. I mean, Spurgeon was the great hero, and there were rumors that Spurgeon was going to come to Toronto. And Fife, well, if he comes, we got to shut him down on the whole issue of communion. Don't let him say a word on that. And he didn't hesitate to argue that Spurgeon was unscriptural, and his unscripturalness of his view virtually endorsed the era of paedobaptism. Despite his close friendship with Fife, however, MacPhail remained steadfast in upholding the primacy of the local church and its concomitant freedom from all external authority. However, MacPhail's quarrel with Fife is yet another reflection. He actually went public. Fife had the Christian Freeman, which was his newspaper, which he would later rename the Canadian Baptist. He published the first of MacPhail's letters against him, and then he refused to publish any more. And so Fife found another venue, and it shattered their friendship. Yet MacPhail's quarrel with Fife is yet another reflection of 19th century Ontario Baptist individualism. Under the impress of the writings of influential theologians like the American Baptist Francis Wayland, the president of Brown University, Baptists in Ontario, like their cousins in the United States, began to lose touch with the early connectionalism which had bound Baptists together in associations in both the British Isles and colonial America. Local churches were now being viewed as independent democracies, and it was wrong and dangerous to speak of the interdependence of churches. Daniel MacPhail died in 1875. He had a stroke in 1871 that removed the power of speech. William Davies lived well into the 20th century, dying at the age of 90 in 1921. 5 years after the former's death, William McMaster funded the establishment of Toronto Baptist College at the southwest corner of University Avenue and Bloor Street. As William Gillespie, I don't know if you read this thesis, I think it's very convincing, rightly argued in a 1990 doctoral thesis, the school's confession of faith, which all the faculty had to sign, was at that point reflective of a largely province-wide doctrinal consensus. Along with classic Calvinism, this doctrinal statement affirmed that the immersion in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit was the only gospel baptism, and that only those so baptized were entitled to communion at the Lord's table. Davies might well have been critical of yet another of William McMaster's philanthropic enterprises, yet surely he would have rejoiced in this confessional expression of Baptist identity. And yet, the keynote of Baptist freedom and individualism was never far from the surface in the New Toronto School. Their first historian, Albert Henry Newman, who had become justly famous for his volumes of Baptist history that he wrote during summer vacations in his Muskoka cottage on Lake Joseph. Last summer, I was up in the Muskokas, and I was determined to go and find it. I couldn't find the cottage, or even the place where it was. I'm going to go back again this summer. Listed the major principles of Baptist life in an article that was published in the McMaster Monthly Journal in 1893. The supreme lordship, the supreme authority of Scripture, the necessity of regenerate church membership, the independence of the local church, and notice, absolute freedom of conscience and freedom in maintaining religious thought and feeling in religious life and in church organization. Maintaining this delicate balance between confessionalism and freedom at the core of Ontario Baptist identity would, as is well known, eventually begin to fracture in the first decade of the 20th century and eventually shatter completely in the mid to late 1920s. And yet, for a generation of 40 years, that balance held. And Baptists like the Canadian war poet, now we get to our Canadian war poet, Bernard Freedom Trotter, were educated at McMaster. In a volume of his poetry, his father, Thomas Trotter, who served as the 5th president of Acadia University from 1897 to 1906, thrown through the press after his son had been killed in action on the Western Front. There's a poem entitled Morning Prayer. It's actually a number of the poems are very moving. The following selection reflects the best of Ontario Baptist piety in the era we have been considering. Hadameus, oh my Father, hear the cry of this poor soul.
I don't see a father in your context. What was your father's first and last name?
Sorry about that. My voice is picking up Siri.
I'll say Hunter.
I thought that was a comment from Acadia. Okay, we will go back. Hadameus, oh my Father, hear the cry of this poor soul. Punish not my sins, but rather in thy mercy make me whole. Doubt and fear pursue or take me. Faith and I, oh weak are we. I am lost if thou forsake me. Pity my humility. Save me from the name of scorner. Teach me how to help the weak. Lift the fallen. Soothe the mourner. Comfort those who comfort seek. Make me like an ever liker. Holy Jesus, kind of me. Thank you.